We all made it. We're to the end, and I want to thank Jenna and everyone else for putting this together. It has been a wonderful, if exhausting time, as the best conferences always really are. I was supposed to come here to talk about John Huntsman and Mitt Romney. Oops. Then John Huntsman dropped out, and so we're not interested in him anymore. And instead, then, I'm going to discuss the relationship between Mormonism and the American progressive movement. I'm going to argue that 20th century Mormonism's intellectual ideals, its organizational culture, everything from the lyrics to a popular children's hymn that run, "Teach me all that I must do to live with him someday," from that hymn to Mitt Romney's leadership style, all of this, I'm going to say, reflects a fruitful relationship between 19th century Mormon theology and the progressive movement of early 20th century America. The phrase we will be talking about here is eternal progression, a phrase which moved to the center of the Mormon lexicon in this period. This phrase means humanity's destiny, what it is, how we attain it, the fact that it is a process of development and change over time, the slow tempering of the human soul towards divinity through long effort of a lifetime, and perhaps after. Now, these ideas had very deep roots in Mormon history, but the encounter with progressivism revitalized them. Progressivism offered Mormons new language, new concepts, new forms of institutions that Mormons still rely on today. Now a word about what progressive means. Today, of course, people to the left of the political center have adopted the word progressive to replace the word liberal, which George H.W. Bush spoke with enough scorn to kill in the 1988 presidential election. To folks at Think Progress or Daily Kos, progressivism means a full-throated endorsement of the Democratic platform and a desire to push it a little further to the left. If you are disappointed with Barack Obama for not doing something, as opposed to being annoyed at something he did, you're probably a progressive. So it's something of a shame, however, that the word has been so neatly slotted into the dull polarities of today's American politics, because 100 years ago, progressivism offered a completely different take on the possibilities of American life. For example, listen to Simon Patten. Simon Patten was one of the founders of American sociology. He was the founder of the Wharton School of Business. He was a man dedicated to what progressivism in this period understood about human nature and human potential. When poverty is gone, that to begin with, the last formidable obstacle to the upward movement of the human race will have disappeared. It is for us to unite all of our social activities, whose motive forces are charity, religion, philanthropy, revolt, unrest, all of these into a philosophy that is social, not sectional, in that it gives to all of them a reorganized and rational body of evidence on which to build. This is heady stuff. Many Americans, then, in the 30 or so years before the First World War broke out in 1914, shared this rather extraordinary optimism about the capacity of human civilization to improve itself, and the most dedicated of these were the progressives. Now, for a long time, Americans, particularly evangelical Americans, believed their nation to be God's new Israel and destined for greatness. But progressives found the nation's strength in a new place. Not necessarily in the favor of God, but in human rationality and science and self-government. They believed that these things were on their way to making the United States the most perfect nation in human history. They believed that social sciences had discerned great truths about human nature and about how human societies worked, and that therefore it is possible, given the right amount of information, to put together a consumers' league and tweak society in precisely the way you wanted to do it, so you could end poverty, end alcoholism, end prostitution, educate, uplift, civilize everybody, absolutely everybody. So that is the first marker of progressivism. Confidence in bureaucracy, confidence in science, confidence in expertise. There's another as well, though, and that is confidence in what human potential might accomplish, given sufficient education and self-discipline. Now again, this isn't entirely new. Many 19th century evangelicals had then and still today advocate for a form of Christian perfectionism attained through piety and through the Holy Spirit. But again, what is interesting is the extent to which progressives downplayed these metaphysical means while still clinging to this utopian end of perfection. They bound it to the promise of social sciences, the possibilities of education, and more than anything else, to correct organization. We saw that in Simon Patton's exultation about the upward progress of the race, but let's also look at Jane Addams, who more than anybody else was perhaps the icon of American progressivism. She founded Hull House, a home for immigrant women and children in Chicago that offered job training, food, shelter, opportunities intended to uplift and civilize the poor. She declared that the impulse towards progressive reform was, quote, identical with that necessity which urges us on towards social and individual salvation. Progressivism teaches that without the advance and improvement of the whole society, no person can hope for any lasting improvement in his own moral or individual condition. Now, like many progressives, Jane Addams wasn't really conventionally religious. But her language here, her language of salvation, indicates the extent to which progressivism fused technocracy, faith in academia, in science, in the intellect, with the messianic. The progressives sought not only to help the poor, but to refine their souls, not merely to educate the immigrants, but to instill in them virtue, not only to feed people, but finally to make them not perhaps Christian, but at least good. So all of this will, I hope, help us answer that naughty old question of why it was the Mormons so readily gave up on their Zion in the desert, their marital radicalism, their economic communalism, and instead immediately made common cause with that American society that had just spent several decades punishing them. The Mormons entered the 20th century with tremendous confidence that the mood of progressivism was really very well suited to their religion. Now, let me be clear what I'm arguing. It's a habit for many historians to discuss this period with words like accommodation or adaptation, language which implicitly argues that the Mormons compromised themselves. And to some extent, yes, perhaps they did. But they also gladly entered into this project, the project of Jane Addams, the project of Simon Patton. And they did so because progressivism spoke to many ideas that Mormons already embraced. With other antebellum utopians, Joseph Smith had taught of the limitless possibilities of human potential, though unlike many of them, he drew that notion from his belief in the ontological continuity between God and man. He created an elaborate priestly hierarchy, binding the promise of salvation to the rituals and organization of his church. And 19th century Mormon thinkers, particularly the brothers Pratt, had built rudimentary connections between science and their faith. So progressive ideals would have appealed to Mormons because they had this inheritance, but also perhaps because progressivism offered to replace something which had been lost. And I want to talk a little bit about what came before I speak about what changed. Joseph Smith was never a very systematic thinker. But in the last years of his life, his ideas about religion and the societies which religions could create orbited around the creation of holy relationships. The heaven he dreamed of was created through the sacralization of human relationships, the sealing of marriages, the linking of ancestors and descendants through proxy ordinances, and of course through the vaguely dynastic system of polygamous marriage. The leaders of Mormonism which followed Joseph Smith systematized these ideas and taught their flock of a heaven of interlocking kingdoms, each centered upon a righteous man whose glory was measured by the size of his family, the number of wives, and the number of children. This was presumed to be done in the image of God, the literal father of humankind, who sought to exalt his children as their wives might exalt him. And this is all vaguely pre-modern, right? It's even medieval in a sense. A heaven predicated on ceremonies, rituals, the creation of kinship bonds in the same way that the King of France might marry his daughter to the King of England in order to end a war. But the end of polygamy destroyed this. Nonetheless, Mormons continued to value the ideas central to their religion. the literal likeness between humanity and God, the holiness of their relationships that bound them to him, the promise of humanity's eventual ascendance to participation in divinity, the sacred structures that the priesthood could create. What I want to do here today, then, is talk about some ways in which several Mormons translated these ideas with the aid of progressive language. They drew very much on the ideas of early 20th century social scientists, thinkers, reformers, and they drew their soteriology away from the static, dynastic, polygamous afterlife and towards a language of development, of evolution, of the cultivation of character through participation in the rationalized institutional structures that replaced the kin-based community that polygamy had created. The three men that we'll be spending the most time with here were all leaders of the church in the early 20th century. John Whitsoe, James Talmage, B.H. Roberts. They were all European immigrants. They all were converted as children with their families. Talmage and Whitsoe were highly educated. They both had PhDs in the sciences. Roberts had a college education as well, though his education seems to have been much more that of an autodidact than anything else. They all served in the highest leadership of the church. They wrote official manuals of study and served as spokesmen for their faith. But more important than the topics of their education were the habits of mind that they learned while they were getting their PhDs. Their educations gave them a very progressive faith in the possibilities of human science, the capacities of rationality, and their conviction that scientific language could be used to express the truths of their religion, and that the application of scientific principles could advance the work of redemption. Whitsoe declared that, quote, the only rational philosophy is based on science. Now, many Protestant progressives dealt with the challenges of science, to the Bible, evolution, things like this, and argued instead that God's benevolent hand could be seen in the progress of science. We can understand God's salvation by seeing his hand in the rise of democratic government, in the rise of education, the spread of technology, things like this. To these Protestants, as men like, say, Harry Emerson Fosdick said, science can clarify and enlighten Scripture. Revealed truth should be seen through its lens. Mormons would not necessarily go that far, but they believed that the language of progressive social science best expressed what Mormonism taught about the human experience. In so doing, then, I'm going to argue here that they gave intellectual birth to a revitalized church organization, an organization targeted at the cultivation of character through education, work, and self-discipline, a church shorn of polygamy and instead based on Joseph Smith's profound optimism about individual human potential. With a few alterations, this achievement remains the Mormonism largely believed by most Latter-day Saints today. Their first task, then, was the reduction of the universe to something understandable and explicable through science. Liberal Protestants had done a lot of work to this end, but Mormons had a great deal of raw material for the effort in the ideas of Joseph Smith. He repudiated the creation ex nihilo, depicting God as a craftsman rather than as a creator per se. He insisted that the supernatural, the spiritual, was merely matter in another form. He moved the divine and the human onto the same ontological plane. To the progressive theologians, then, Roberts, Whitsoe, and Talmage, all of this meant that God was God because he understood and manipulated science. Therefore, they begin to speak about religion in the language of scientific law. James Talmage's magnum opus, the 1915 biography, Jesus the Christ, explained that Christ's suffering and death satisfied apparently universal laws of justice, which bound even God's desire to forgive sin, should they not be satisfied. Whitsoe asserted that all of human existence was governed by what he called, quote, the moderate law of evolution, neither a brute natural selection nor blind aimless change, but rather teleological development towards a particular directed end. Whitsoe even found in this law of evolution God's plan for his children, their course through earth life to the afterlife, and eventually exaltation. As Whitsoe said, quote, the Mormon plan of salvation is strictly scientific, and it rests upon the irrevocable laws of the universe. The truth behind Spencer's law of evolution and the doctrines taught by the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith are one and the same. Now, the Spencer referred to here is Herbert Spencer, a British social philosopher and a journalist, the man who coined the term survival of the fittest, and whose ideas undergirded much of what progressives believed about the progress of human civilization. Spencer argued that the social application of Darwin's ideas meant that all things were both in ceaseless change, but also that all things were tending towards increased complexity and increased development. For the progressives, this meant that human civilization and human beings themselves, in fact, were tending towards increased sophistication, increased refinement, increased advancement. This progress derived from a process of growth and change through struggle and conflict and overcoming of obstacles. For Mormons, then, especially these three Mormons, his philosophy reconciled their faith and their world better than anything else they found. Whitsoe wrote that, quote, "The philosophy of Herbert Spencer is the only philosophy that harmonizes with our knowledge of today." Joseph Smith had taught that human beings were of the same type of being that God is, but for these Mormons, human beings were literally the children of God. An inference that many of Joseph Smith's followers had made was of prime importance. They begin to understand then the process of divinization less in the dynastic language of polygamy, that is, marrying into God's family, like you might marry into a royal family in the Middle Ages, and more through the language of development and evolution that Spencer had suggested. This manifested in two ways. First, these Mormons begin to emphasize their relationship with God in terms of biological inheritance, not in terms of rank or status. The traits of divinity were inborn, passed along from parent to child, inherited. Secondly, they begin describing their cultivation of these traits in terms of effort, refining personal character through education, through overcoming obstacles, through committing to the character-building work that their church was beginning to offer them. They stood convinced then that godhood was every human being's inheritance, provided that you put in the effort. First relationship. In 1916, the first presidency of the church issued a proclamation clarifying the relationship between the Father, the Son, and humanity. Following James Talmage, they identified Jehovah, the God of the Hebrew Bible, as the premortal Jesus Christ, acting as the agent of his Father. Insisting upon this distinction was critical, according to the first presidency, because, quote, "Jesus Christ is not the Father of the spirits who have taken or yet will take bodies on this earth, for he is one of them. He is the Son, as they are the sons and daughters of Elohim." Talmage applauded what he called, quote, "the humble offer of Jesus, the firstborn to assume mortality and to live among men as their exemplar and their teacher, observing the sanctity of man's agency, but teaching them also to use aright their divine heritage." As B.H. Roberts said, the network of these relationships here meant that Mormons, quote, Mormons must think as Christ did, that it is no robbery to be equal to God, for they can claim the same inheritance as could he. B.H. Roberts wove together Joseph Smith's argument that human spirits were of the same kind of God and his inheritors' arguments that human beings were the literal children of God. He reconciled these two things and taught Mormons the understanding of human identity that they accept for the most part today. That is, human beings are both uncreated, co-eternal, of the same divine substance as God is, but also the literal children of God, given spiritual and then physical birth through God's creative powers, and therefore capable of inheriting, biologically more than anything else, the same degree of divinity and glory that their Father had. The question then became how to cultivate this inheritance, and here we come to the notion of effort. Roberts drew on what he called, quote, Herbert Spencer's primary doctrine of evolution to explain how this worked. He said, the principle, that is evolution, is induction from experience. That is, Spencer's theories demonstrated that growth and progress came only through living in the world, from dealing with the trials of life. I want to here turn to a little example of the way James Talmage spoke of the atonement. Talmage emphasizes in his biography that, quote, the Savior took upon himself the burden of the sins of mankind in Gethsemane, and even the cross could not exceed the bitter anguish through which he had successfully struggled and passed. Now, Douglas Davies, a theologian, has argued that Mormons emphasize Gethsemane more than the cross because they want to stress the fact that Jesus chose to confront this trial, that Jesus had to take this upon himself, overcome this, and it is only through overcoming that freely chosen suffering that true progress could come. Mormons had long cultivated a sort of theology of suffering, a way of talking about persecution and dilemmas that meant their character was being refined through torment. In the Progressive era, this becomes really the way Mormons cultivate divinity. B.H. Roberts perhaps articulated these ideas most eloquently when he wrote, quote, I believe it is consistent with right reason to say that some of the lowliest walks of life, the paths which lead into the deepest valleys of sorrow and up the most rugged steeps of adversity, are the very ones which, if a man travels in, will best accomplish the object of his existence in this world. Now, what did these ideas mean in practice? Like many progressives, Mormons came to believe that bureaucratic organization could foster this sorts of spiritual reform. I said earlier that the institution of the church comes to replace the old kingship networks of polygamy as the ground on which salvation is worked out. And that salvation increasingly came through ideas of service, of self-discipline, of doing work. In particular, the late 19th and early 20th century found Mormons engaged in a massive project directed at the training of their young people, the cultivation of a Mormon character in their young men and young women. And Mormon women were really at the forefront of this effort. All of these organizations, Sunday schools, a young man's association, a young woman's association, a primary, interpreted the practice of Mormon religion in terms of teaching right behavior. Susie Young Gates, Brigham Young's daughter and a leader in Mormonism, wrote that the Young Women's Society of the Salt Lake's 8th Ward was resolved, quote, inasmuch as order is the first law of heaven, we will endeavor to learn the law by making ourselves acquainted with the principles of life and salvation. We will study all the literature that will qualify us to become ornaments in the kingdom of God, that we may merit the approbation of our brothers, our sisters, and of God himself. Most influential in this effort was perhaps Amy Brown Lyman, who is essentially a Mormon version of Jane Addams. In fact, she had met Jane Addams at one point while traveling in Chicago, and when she returned to Utah, she mounted all sorts of efforts here. She became, for years and years and years, the director of church social services. She put together efforts in the Relief Society to aid the poor and to perform charitable work in Salt Lake City. And she said later in her life that, quote, no work could be more important or satisfying than that of raising human life to its highest possible level through charitable work. We see here then this connection between charitable work, exerting this sort of social effort, and the cultivation of personal character that's really the hallmark of progressivism. All of these auxiliaries begin to appear in Mormonism in the late 19th century. All these ones I've already mentioned, but also a Sunday school, the Relief Society Organization for Women, prayer groups, all of this. Joseph F. Smith, who was president of the church from 1901 to 1918, made participation in whatever groups your age and gender made appropriate an expectation if you were to be considered a practicing Latter-day Saint. And this happened for the first time. These things had largely been voluntary before then. Now, participation in these vast arrays of auxiliaries that Mormons have today became an expectation, something Mormons were supposed to do. By the early mid-20th century, then, to be a Mormon increasingly came to mean meeting a standard of personal behavior achieved primarily through participation in the institution of the church. And Mormonism still retains this profound devotion to its institution. By the time of the Great Depression, Mormons had erected the church welfare program, a system of aid to the needy, which encouraged recipients to offer labor and to cultivate habits of thrift and industry in return for any benefits. But the argument perhaps is best reflected in the massive project of the mid-20th century that is called correlation. this systematic reorganization, reaggregation of lines of church authority, which brought all auxiliaries under the supervision of members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which established a regular and uniform curriculum, and which oversees church publications for orthodoxy. One church leader argued that the process of correlation was not simply organizational, that it was not merely intended to help the church's bureaucracy run better. Rather, he said, this is a necessary tool in God's plan for saving souls. The education that is administered through correlated materials is notoriously oversimplified. Many Mormons complain about this, but it is targeted less at increasing knowledge than it is upon encouraging Mormons to become better and more dutiful people. The lesson on the Sabbath day in the current Sunday school manual, for instance, dwells very briefly on the origins of the Sabbath or the theology of the Sabbath, and instead devotes most of its time to questions about how faithful saints can better observe the Sabbath in their own lives. This is education as moral improvement, more or less. Now, while his political career was still limited to Massachusetts, Mitt Romney declared himself a progressive, a clip that will surely come back to haunt him. But he was more right than he knew. Mormons still retain this sort of unadulterated confidence and organization that many Americans left in the trenches of the world wars or in the food lines of the Great Depression. Though the vast majority of Mormons identify as conservative or Republican, they speak with justified pride about their church's welfare program, about the vast and capable church bureaucracy that makes Mormonism an identical experience in Provo or Paraguay or Poland. Their faith's simultaneous dedication to business-like efficiency and the refinement of souls is something that can seem dissonant at a time, but really can be traced, I think, to this period. Romney is a technocrat, but he is also a technocrat convinced that technocracy can make people better. This peculiar fusion of ideas that have long since been severed in American politics, that the Mormons, oddly enough, are the ones who still keep alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and all the panelists. Is Joe around with a microphone? I guess not. So please use the microphone to ask questions, and we'll have a lively discussion, I'm sure.
Okay, it looks like
Emily's a switch.
yes, sir. It looks like, presuming Romney is the nominee, we're 2 weeks now from the general election. He's up on the polls from Obama. Okay, so we're 2 weeks, Romney's the nominee, we're 2 weeks up from the general election in November. The Democrats tried everything. I suspect, and I predict, they're going to throw the Mormon bomb a week or two before. What's the Mormon bomb? It's going to be something to do with the church, and it's going to be spread out among the public, and it's not going to look good. And then you have to ask, will Harry Reid sit back quietly and let the church bomb explode, or is he going to come and defend them? My guess is he'll probably be quiet about it. You can comment if you like.
It won't be a bomb. It won't come 2 weeks before the election. It will be subtle. It will be quiet. It will be constant from the beginnings of the general election. There can't possibly be amongst those activists and those people most close to and most committed to Obama's reelection. There can't possibly be an absence of people pondering how best can we use the unfamiliarity, the strangeness, the outsiderness of Mormonism to peel away likely supporters of Mitt Romney as a candidate. I strongly suspect that if any of these people are contemplating, what you suggest, some sort of bomb, some sort of, scandalous attack on some, outrageous theological element of the Mormon faith, that it would go down terribly. But what wouldn't necessarily go down terribly are subtle ways of communicating the difference and the oddity and the out-of-placeness of Mitt Romney, and do so in such a way as to target people who probably would have ended up voting for Romney, but are not deeply committed. The people that are deeply committed, conservative Republicans and so forth, they're going to vote for him to get rid of President Obama no matter what. But people on the bubble, especially evangelicals, moderate evangelicals on the bubble, that sort of subtle messaging would work. I really doubt that any smart people are thinking, all we need to do is wait and then expose the temple ceremony and it'll make a difference. No, I think that would go down terribly. But the other stuff, the more subtle stuff, I can't believe that there are people that aren't thinking about that right now. That's my answer.
Kara.
I was wondering to what extent these progressive Mormon leaders, like progressive Jewish or Protestant leaders, participated in eugenics work during the 20th century. It seems to be sort of the elephant in the room when you're talking about progressive scientific thinking, and that didn't come into your talk. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
And that is, these progressives are very charming in a lot of ways. Their kind of unfettered optimism and their naivete is very charming. There's also this element of social control in progressivism. There's something that we can just make people do better things, and we can make people be better. And when you don't see a lot of eugenics in this early Mormonism, but you do see a lot of talk as polygamy is coming to a close about how polygamy is making Mormonism something of an ethnicity, and how George Q. Cannon speaks about how polygamy is making Mormons a better race, that it is breeding faithfulness into their bones. So that may be the version within Mormonism that you don't see, or that you see elsewhere in more scientific and technocratic progressives.
Hi, two comments, brief. One, as to the whole progressive thing, I actually see that leaching into my own personality to a large extent. My friends call me an evangelical elitist because I'm an elitist, but I want everybody else to be one too. As far as the language barrier, I notice that when I speak with a lot of my non-Mormon friends, there is an obvious language barrier in trying to communicate what Mormon congregations, Mormon wards really are, and what Mormon worship is really like. And I kind of wonder how much the churches, we offer this Christianity plus kind of explanation, how much of that plays into their media's representation and this Protestant prism that you're talking about.
The church's Christianity plus?
Well, it's like we have the Virgin Mary and the Angel Moroni. We have Christianity, but we have more of it. This kind of way that I think the church has kind of talked about it has played into that a little bit. And I just wonder how much that really plays into that, or if this is something that's completely from the outside.
How to answer that? I think the church has done better to try to build bridges, verbal vocabulary bridges, try to use terms that make more sense. The church public relations people are all over trying to explain Mormonism. But the examples I gave you are completely current, so I don't see a lot of improvement in that. I still think it's such a foreign world for most journalists to go. And not very many of them actually go to a Mormon ward or go to a service or something. And if they do, they have really no idea what's going on there. There's not a good analog for it elsewhere. And So, I mean, I'd say the best thing is these bridge-building scholars who can speak both languages, or members who can speak both languages can say, oh, in our experience, we call it this. Because there are common experiences. It's just that they call them different things. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's getting a little better, maybe.
I have an observation about that. Just the tone and the quality of religion coverage generally. When I first started here in 1985, I started to get calls from reporters, and typically I'd have to spend the first 15, 20 minutes briefing the reporter about what to ask me for his or her story. And then, in part because of the rise of the religious right, in the 1990s, there was this real emphasis on having reporters covering religion with some knowledge of religion. And I mean, here at Columbia, we have a joint program with the journalism school and the religion department, for example. And for a while, as you know, Peggy, there was this sort of golden age of religion reporting. The Dallas Morning News had this, huge coverage and so forth, and other papers as well. What's happened, unfortunately, over the last decade is with the recession, is that these are the first people to leave, to lose their job. My electronic address book is full of names of people who were regulars and who have just lost their jobs. I mean, Neelam Banerjee, just name a few names. Gus Niebert, now at Syracuse, and it's real. It's unfortunate, I think.
Well, that's exactly my experience as well. The political reporters who call me are relatively unfamiliar with I would say they even don't know the Protestant.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
I mean, they don't know Mormons, or even Protestants, and so it's all a foreign world to them, and that makes the coverage of Mitt Romney really problematic, I think.
The scholar of religion, Jonathan Smith, has argued that the academy suffers from a Protestant bias, and by what he means by that is the liberal Protestants who became the earliest academics who studied religion were people who had generally come to the conclusion that the best form of religion is personal and spiritual, and it's about ethics and about doing nice things. And so any form of religion that added on to that was seen as creating useless accretions and strange rituals and stuff that was backwards and retrograde and actually interfered with living a good and ethical life. And I think this has, in the 20th century, become sort of what Americans have expected about religion in general. That religion is useful insofar as it teaches people to do nice things. But rituals and strange underwear and stuff like that are all weird and necessarily foreign, the plus that you're talking about.
Hi, my name is Matthew Teeter, and I'm a Mormon. I'm from upstate New York, and as I grew up, my best friends were always evangelicals or Jews, and then I moved out to Utah and got the culture shock of being with other Mormons. And I found it fascinating, seeing the evolution of the approach to Mitt Romney and the concern, and I think a lot of the concern about what his presidency would be comes from ignorance. But then at the same time, my best friend actually, who is an evangelical Christian, he said, I know your religion very well, and he does, because when I went on my mission, he actually started investigating the church and wanted to know more, and then decided not to join, and he knows we have long conversations. And the issue of theology, I think is a little nebulous, because that's a very broad stroke. And he says it's he doesn't use this word, but it's the epistemology that concerns him about how Mormons approach decision making. We don't discredit rationalism. We collect, we believe in the scientific method, but ultimately we do take our decisions, very important decisions, to God, and we ask, for help in that. And a lot of times it comes through confirmation, but at the same time, sometimes we receive an answer that doesn't jive with what we've researched, and we will still go with that decision because it's what we believe God wants us to do. And he says, he comes up with some extreme hypothetical, but ultimately, it's like, if you are a believing Mormon, that is what you will do. If you are a good Mormon and adhere to your theology, your epistemological theology. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that. If somebody distilled it to that core concern, what would the appropriate response be, or what would your response be?
I say that your friend is very observant. I was actually having lunch with Damon Linker yesterday, and I was kind of laying out for him in a confused sort of way the thesis of my argument about this drive that we have within the church to experience this knowingness, this confirmation, this fact that we're taking from these experiences, from our encounter with the Book of Mormon, from our dealings with trials, some sort of truth that we can know. And he said, well, the real distinctiveness, civilly speaking, about the Mormon Church isn't really their theology; it's their epistemology. I mean, that's the word that he used. I do think that broadly speaking, it's important for members of the church, as we interact more and more with not just non-members, but start interacting on a different level through many different venues than we have before. To recognize that our recourse to this kind of collectively experienced confirmation, this experience of truth, this sort of decision making, as you talk about it, that ends with a personal knowledge, a personal revelation. I mean, it's a very, very powerful spiritual experience, and it's not a unique characteristic of our church. I mean, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, for a long time really embraced a similar sort of collective experience of the truth, and some versions of Quakerism still strongly emphasize it. But amongst a lot of the rest of the kind of dominant voices in our kind of quasi-establishment or non-establishment establishment, the civil religion of the United States, being more amenable to a discourse that doesn't end with a testimony is, I think, more common. And I think that we will have to adapt, and maybe the religious mainstream in the United States will have to adapt to our differences that way. The way we really emphasize epistemology, the way we really emphasize knowingness in perhaps a different way, and probably also to a different degree than most other Christian churches in modern liberal America do.
Caleb.
Yeah, hi, my name's Caleb Maskell. I'm a grad student at Princeton. If I may just a tiny comment on the epistemology question, it seems like there's a lot of similarity between Mormon epistemology and, say, Pentecostal epistemology, which is becoming so vastly mainstream that maybe it's the liberals who are going to have to reconsider something, but just that's not my question. Question for Matt.
But I would suggest that if there was somebody, coming from a strongly Pentecostal background, a strongly Pentecostal background, who is making a serious run for a presidential nomination, they would be experiencing much of the same sort of outsiderness.
That sounds right to me. I was thinking more on the sort of general religious plane, that the epistemology of testimony and surrounding spiritual knowledge is on the, certainly in the global majority. But politically, you're right. But my question's for Matthew. I'm thinking about the narratives that inform the transition that you're talking about. Sort of a particular question, and then maybe you could just comment. Are you saying that the transition to progressivism, are Mormons the perfect American progressives in the sense that it has to be the kingdom of God in America? And is that why you think that Mormon progressivism has been sustained through the kind of typical story of disillusionment?
I think, well, and pinning down this great woolly beast that is progressivism is a very difficult thing, and there have been books and books and books written about it. But I think Mormons adopt a lot of progressive language and progressive ideas, but they are, to a large degree, too religious for many of the other progressives. For people like Adams or Simon Patton, who came from Protestant backgrounds and Calvinist backgrounds, but were not explicitly religious. The Mormons take all this notion and turn it to kind of this fantastical religious and soteriological end. So they're not perhaps the ideal progressives that many other progressives would have selected. Does that get to what you're asking?
It does. Well, maybe what I would just say then is, are they the strongest, the most resilient strain of progressive because of the way progressivism and Americanism are wed?
Right.
So when you hit World War I, a lot, and subsequent years, a lot of people give up on progressivism because they give up on a certain vision of Americanness. Is it the case that you think Mormons are so bound to a vision of what America must be?
You're emphasizing, I think, the Americanness of it perhaps more than I would, but I would say that a lot of the ideas and ideals that you are probably implicit in that word for you are very much there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Last question.
Okay.
Oh, maybe. Oh, go ahead. We'll do two. I'm sorry.
Okay, but I have two questions.
Choose.
The one was a comment, and the other was the question. The comment is that, of course, in Mormon, this is sort of mostly directed at Matt, in the Mormon church in the 20th century, you definitely had that very strong progressive influence, Roberts, Talmage, Whitlow school, but in the Mormon church, that it may be deep in the practice, but on an ideological level, it was shoved aside by another strain of Mormonism.
The Fielding Smiths and the
Joseph Fielding
McConkeys and all
Smith,
that. I don't actually think that's necessarily correct, but you can complete.
Okay, well, my question, or my observation is that seems to parallel what was happening in the larger society, where the old social gospel liberal Protestant progressives have been pushed aside by the rise of evangelical Christianity. That's more of an observation. This is the question. Suppose that Willard Romney is elected president of the United States. How will we deal with the inevitable tendency of that will follow of the news media, the populace, the world, to begin to equate Mormonism with a President Romney's policies, and start to hold Mormons, individual Mormons in the church accountable for policies that people disagree with, or mistakes or failures that he makes?
I can.
That's sort of for everybody.
Okay, I can address the first issue. I think the key is in your phrase, practice, right? Because I think assuredly, actually, Joseph Fielding Smith and McConkie and these other conservative theologians still hold very, very much to this ideology of effort and ideology of dedication to church organization that really very much characterizes what Whitlow and Roberts and all the rest had set up. They're more biblical and more scripturist in their theology than the progressives were. And one reason why progressivism could enter Mormonism was because men like Whitlow were interested in outside scholarship, in work and ideas and philosophy from outside the church. Fielding Smith and McConkie are not. They spurn all of that. They say, we're going to turn to the scriptures and the scriptures alone. But by then, this intense dedication to the proposition that human beings can make themselves perfect, this near-Pelagianism, is very, very deeply embedded in McConkie and in Joseph Fielding Smith as well. So that is what I would say to your first point. As to the second, actually, I don't know that I have much. So one of you guys want to take a shot at it?
I think Ken Jennings already wrote about this, which is it's dangerous for the Mormon's most visible figure to be a politician, because inevitably Mormons will like and not like things he does, and everyone else will like and not like things, and the almost complete, identifying him as a Mormon. Ken just said, I hope he doesn't win. you know, for that reason. I don't know if, obviously a lot of Mormons are cheering for him to win, but I think it is problematic for the church, I gotta say.
But there is there's a possible kind of silver lining to that, or I don't know if it's a negative or positive thing, but there's another side to it. Some of us were talking about some of these very issues last night, and Dave Campbell over here made the comment, and I think he's absolutely right, that if Mitt Romney wins the presidency, you will see the church leadership doing everything in their power to distance themselves from any perception of connection between the church and the decisions that he makes. They will not be able to succeed at that entirely, obviously. People will think what they will think, but they will really try to do that. And I think he's right. I think that, you know, one possible consequence of a Mitt Romney presidency is an even more politically sensitive church leadership, because they will be concerned about perceptive backlashes otherwise.
Yeah. There would be no Prop 8 under President Romney.
Just something I'm trying to wrap my head around. It seems like one of the most interesting dynamics about this whole conference, in this Mormon moment, there's this push for mainstreaming, I think. And I think a lot of, and there, I guess what I'm talking about, there's this contrast between Mormons' inherent desire to be mainstream, but also our love of being peculiar. You know, so we both are hesitant when Mitt Romney gets questioned about his faith because we don't want him judged by that, but we also love the fact that everyone's talking about us. You know, most Mormons won't go to see the Book of Mormon musical, but we love the fact that there is one, you know. So I guess my question is, how does that play out going forward, and especially in kind of a post-Mormon moment? So say Mitt Romney doesn't win the presidency and the looking glass is turned elsewhere. And how do we deal with suddenly we don't get as much attention as maybe we'd like, and how that dynamic plays out?
Myself, I'd be really happy to get Mormons out of the limelight, but that's really selfish.
Time will go on, you know. People will, you know, grow up. They'll, you know, they'll be kids, they'll be teenagers, they'll be young adults, and there'll be a Mormon president. And then they'll encounter Mormons in their life. You know, their coworker will be a Mormon, their college roommate will be a Mormon, they'll date a Mormon, and they'll say, oh yeah, that was Romney. You know, there will be this adaptation, and the adaptation will be on both sides. It'll be in America's kind of civil religion in the way Mormons are treated, but it'll be within the Mormon church itself. I mean, it happened to Catholicism. You know, we still have this Protestant lens, but they eventually made room, you know, for the people who go to Mass, though the Mass changed. Presumably, eventually, they will make room for people who go to testimony meetings, though probably that will change also.
Okay, I think we need to I have several people I want to thank before we conclude in just a minute here. First of all, our participants on the panel and all of the participants in the conference, thank you so much. I again want to thank Emily and Chelsea in particular, and the Institute for Religion and Culture and Public Life. Actually, the head of the Institute, Mark Taylor, is here. And Mark is probably responsible more than anyone else for this conference because he kept overcoming my resistance to this idea, and eventually he prevailed, and that's why we have this conference. So thank you, Mark. And finally, to my co-organizer, Jana Reese. Thank you so much, Jana. Thank you all.